we're really excited to have James Eash here. James is from Action Housing. And the reason we wanted to have James come speak to the group is to help give people a better understanding of the way that permanently affordable housing is created in Pittsburgh. We've talked a lot in this group about market rate homes and mixed income, but Action Housing, I think, has a unique perspective on this as a developer of affordable homes, including a new building right down the street here on the corner of Forward and Murray. And so I think James has some slides that he was going to go through and then just really have some discussion of how they do their work and how they actually get these developments from idea to actually people's homes. So we'll bring James up. We'll put his slides up. He'll go through a few of the slides, but I think we want to kind of keep this conversational, and I'm sure people will have questions along the way. So feel free to raise hands and ask them. And then once he's done, we'll just do some moderated discussion.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, James.
Thank you. I'll try to clip this so I don't have to hold it the entire time. And I do know that I'm not in the CMU class, so my apologies. I haven't changed the title slide. But good to be here. Thanks for having me. This was just said, James Eash with Action Housing. This is a longer presentation. I'm going to jump around a little bit in talking to some of you just to try to hit a couple different things. Feel free to shoot questions as we go through this, but in general, what I'd like to do is just give a little bit of an introduction, run through the sources and uses for a recent project, and then jump into specifically the low-income housing tax credit program, which is how we fund a majority of the projects that we at Action Housing do on the real estate side. Since it seemed like there was a lot of interest in the specifics of the biggest funding mechanism that there is for affordable housing. So you'll have to bear with me because we're going to be jumping around a little bit, but if we can go to the next slide. So we always start these conversations with what is affordable housing. There's a lot of preconceived notions about what it is, both right and wrong, usually more negative than positive. But in general, it's housing that is affordable. If you go back to the last slide real quick, so these are 4 of our projects, right? You may recognize this one. We're in Pittsburgh. It may be on an automatic thing. I don't know. If you're in Pittsburgh, you always have to say like what used to be there, right? So this is the old Poli site, the Krause Commons, and there's a new building to the left of it now. A couple of these other buildings, rehabs in Uptown and in East Liberty. This is the Spinning Plate, so next to the old Whole Foods. And this is the interior of a building that we built on the intersection of Penn and Matilda in Bloomfield. So these would fit right next to any market rate building or unit. So when we talk about affordable housing, it's it doesn't have to be what a lot of people assume that it is, which is low quality, unsafe from a health perspective and a safety perspective. It can be something else. So this is something I'm sure is familiar for this group, but I want to make sure that we're working from kind of the same level playing field here. When we talk about housing that is affordable, we typically say the back of the napkin number is no more than 30% of your income spent towards housing costs. So if it's a monthly income of $3,000, your expense is $900. If you're above 30%, we consider it cost burdened. If you're above 50% of your monthly income towards housing costs, it's severely cost burdened. So those are numbers that you'll see a couple times throughout this presentation. And the numbers here, some of these numbers are a few years old from in some of the reports, but the principle behind it is the same, and in large part things have only gotten worse, unfortunately. So in Pittsburgh today, about 50% of renter households are cost burdened, and 23% of homeowners are cost burdened, just paying more towards their mortgage than what they can afford based on this metric. And what happens when you're cost burdened? You either spend a lot more money on housing costs than what you can really afford, or you go to substandard housing or obviously, affordable housing is a big issue. We've been talking a lot about it more in a nationwide perspective than we ever have. But it's not a new issue. That's not going to come as any surprise. If we go to the next slide, there's this funky political cartoon that I found from like the late 1800s. So if anybody's heard of Pullman, so the Pullman Rail Car Company out of Chicago, they used to have this company town. So you'd work for Pullman, and then you'd go rent a house or an apartment that was owned by Pullman, and you'd shop at the Pullman store. And when not surprisingly, when Pullman, the company, fell in hard times, they dropped wages, but they kept all their rents high, and they kept all, so this poor guy's being squeezed by low wages and high rent. So the point is, this is just an issue that's been around for this is 126 years, 27 years ago. So next slide. What percentage of the city of Pittsburgh households do you think qualify for affordable housing? Anybody else? So this would be anything. So a LIHTC project, low-income housing tax credit, public housing, anything that is rent controlled and is subsidized by public funding. And it's, if you click the next, 38%. Again, this is I think this is 2 years old, so it may be closer to that number. But the point is that it's not. When we talk about affordable housing, there's often an assumption that it's small band of folks who are very poor. But it's really, even in Pittsburgh, is a much larger issue, and this is part of the reason why this has become such a hot topic nationwide. Next slide. So some quick numbers: 38% of households make less than $35,000 or less, so they qualify for housing. There was a study that was done. This is actually going back to the Petito administration, but it was the first time there had been a comprehensive study of how many new units would we need to meet unmet demand for our lowest income renters. So if you could just snap your fingers and solve the issue, how many would we need? 17,000 was the number that they came up with. And it's obviously the issue has gotten a lot greater since then. So that's kind of a starting point that we often work from. Next slide. It's a supply and demand issue. Next slide. And part of that is a lot of the supply is this, right? So we have suburbs, single family housing, and it sounds like your group has been active talking about zoning. So this next part will be familiar to you. So if you go to the next slide, zoning is just restrictive, right? So in land that is zoned for residential use, in a lot of American cities, I think the average is about 70 to 75% of that land. It is illegal to build anything else other than a single family detached home. In Pittsburgh, it's a little bit less than that, about 55%. And the map that you see here shows the amount of land so anything colored is zoned for residential in one way or another. But the red turquoise color is single unit detached housing only. So you have all this land that you could build housing on, but you have to legally, by the zoning code, you're only allowed to build what is really the least efficient way to create housing units. Next slide. And I always point to these two books. I hope these are familiar to some of you. If you take nothing from this presentation other than these two books, I'll feel that I've done it justice. The first is Color of Law. This talks a lot about the history of zoning in the United States and kind of how we got to the really segregated housing that we have. And this book probably did more for me to understand kind of the urban form that we see now than any other book. So fantastic book. And then the New Jim Crow is more about the system of mass incarceration that we have in America. And there's some really good tie-ins with housing here and how the mass incarceration system excludes a lot of folks who are most in need of housing excludes them from any housing support, federal housing support. So those two things tied to zoning, but are just fantastic books in general. Next slide. This is from a report from 21 from the National Low Income Housing Coalition that shows they created something called housing wages. So the lack of affordable housing is both a supply and demand problem. And the issue is that many jobs don't pay enough to even cover the cost of renting a median cost apartment. So what the National Low Income Housing Coalition did was they did this huge study that said, what would you actually have to make if you work full time, 40 hours a week, 52 hours a week, or 52 weeks a year? How much would you have to make per hour to afford just the fair market rent for a two-bedroom rental home? What would that be? So in Pennsylvania, it's about $20. You can see like high cost areas like California, it's almost $40. Florida, 25. So what they found was that in every single state, you would have to make more than double the minimum wage. So there's a demand problem. I had an old boss that said, I wish we could just instantly raise the federal minimum wage to 25, 30 hours, and we'd solve a lot of the issues that we have around affordability. And this is kind of speaking to that issue. So next slide. And this is just a quick calculation of different what different incomes can afford. So we're kind of using that 30% of your income towards housing costs question. So again, minimum wage in Pennsylvania, $7.25. That translates to about $376 a month in housing costs. If you work backwards from what Pittsburgh's median rent is, which I think this is 2022 American Community Survey, median rent of $1,153. You'd have to make $46,000 a year or $24 a month. And then if you look at it from Pittsburgh's median household income, you can see the calculation there is you could afford about $1,500 a month. But that $46,000, yeah.
Your argument, and I'm asking sincerely.
Sure.
So, like, that seems to me that the solution to affordable housing is to just pay people.
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. 100%. Absolutely. It's both. And when I mentioned that story about an old boss saying that, she meant that very sincerely. Like, this is what we need to do, not we want to,
If you just increase wages and don't actually increase housing supply, then that creates inflation and cost of housing. So
it's a simplistic. Yeah, right. I think. Yeah, and this is really just to illustrate what you can afford at different. Yeah, right. No, I think one of the commonalities in these conversations is it's always yes and. Like, we need to do a million things. There's no silver bullet, even though we'd really like to just kind of fix it doing one thing, So yeah, exactly. No problem. And again, questions, feel free to jump in. All right. So next slide. So again, these numbers are a couple of years old, but how much income do people make in Pittsburgh? 16% make less than $15,000 a year, roughly, which means roughly 40% can't afford that median rent that we just talked about in the last slide. So again, this is not a small subset of our population. This is a serious issue. 4 out of every 10 people can't afford median rent. Next slide. And then the other thing we always add to this is transportation. So that is typically any household's second highest cost, usually because it's a car, and owning a car is expensive. So the same kind of back of the napkin calculation. So you have housing of 30%, transportation is usually 15% of your income. So 45% of your income is going towards those two things. Average cost of owning a car in Pittsburgh was calculated just under $9,800 a year. And if you kind of run the numbers there, the median household income, it's not affordable to pay for your housing and transportation. Not a huge revelation there. I think we can all understand that. But it's often the focus is on housing, but it's housing and transportation. And this is also tying into projects that we do. Part of the reason why we're so excited about projects like the two that are down here at Forward and Murray are you're connected to so many things. So you can really live car free if you want to, good access to transportation, all those kind of things. Yeah. There you go. And you can go to the next slide.
I'm looking at the slide and the average cost of car ownership in Pittsburgh being $10,000 a year. And we know that parking, having parking on site for housing is not free.
Right.
It usually adds several $1,000s, if not more, to the cost of a project. What do you see solving that problem through zoning, so that I don't know if your prior projects have had to build parking that your tenants might not need or anything like that?
Every single project, we build parking that doesn't get used. Every single project. So what we'll do within the code is we're allowed reductions based on bicycle parking, things like that. And what we see, just as a practitioner, is maybe half of our tenants have cars. Now this depends where you're located, and we don't always build in the places that have the best transportation, so it varies. But based on our analysis, it's about 50%. So even with that reduction in parking, we're providing more parking than what we need to.
Can I to add on that? Yes, and we should have better transportation, that we fund better. I'm curious, does the city offer any relief? Are you able to buy transit passes for future tenants, and is that counted as an offset? By the way, PRT is finally going to launch permanent low fare income program this year. Finally.
So I don't know of anything like that. We certainly have never used it on our projects. But again, I think one of the big focuses that we've had as an organization in the last, I would say, 10 years or so is twofold. One is energy efficiency. So we try to make our buildings as energy efficient as possible, both for the kind of the greater good of the environment, but then also to lower utility costs for tenants. And then the other is locating in kind of areas of opportunity. So you've got the biggest one being access to transportation. So it's being close to where people work, where they shop, how they get around the city, so that if there's a willingness to live car free, if you want to do that, either because you have it's important to you, or because it costs a lot to own a car, it makes it easy for tenants to do that.
Just out of curiosity, total project cost, how much of it is parking, you think?
Well, it's a good question. It's tough to quantify. And as soon as I say it, I know I'll get it wrong. So obviously, anything structured or anything underground, we very rarely do, because it's super expensive. Although the parking garage that we built across from Cross Commons at the bottom of Murray, that was one of the more expensive parking garages we've ever built. What we typically build is surface parking that is tucked behind the front of our building. So we build on a podium, and then kind of tuck the parking around back, so that it's surface parking, but it's not it's a parking lot. Yeah. But we're still paying for the land. Yep. And you're still paying all the subsurface improvements. You're still laying asphalt. You're still doing all the curb cuts. Yeah, and all of it costs a lot of money. Yeah.
So, sorry. The one thing with
just as it relates to transportation, 42% of all Black Pittsburgh families do not have access to a vehicle. And when you look at like the trickle down impact of that, the way I look at it is with schools, because the Pittsburgh Public Schools has expanded the radius that kids have to walk to school from 1 mile to 1.5 miles. And Black kids are way more likely to be truant. And a lot of that has to do with their own household access to transportation. So and there are no bulk passes I'm the board chair of my pantry, and we're looking for ways to solve the transportation issue at the pantry. And we have no way of like buying 300 a week for clients just to get back and forth to the pantry, which is crazy. Yeah. So, but when I think about the transportation stuff, it's like, it's doubly hard for people, families of color. So I'm done.
And that's honestly, so a lot of the locations, historically, a lot of the locations of low-income housing, whether it was public housing or funded otherwise, was in like far-flung areas, because that's the place where you have cheap land. And it's cheap because it's not close to anything, and nobody really wants to live there, but we'll live there if we have an affordable rent. So that's something that I think is changing, and that's something that we've put as a really high priority.
How does required parking decrease the scale of the projects you can build? So like how many units does it decrease for, say, a 50-unit project?
That's a good question. It doesn't decrease it a lot. It doesn't really affect it too much. It may affect where we locate a project. So there may just be a site that would work otherwise. But the reason for this is really the funding source, and I'll get into that a little bit, because the funding source, the low-income housing tax credit, just based on the size of the funding, it works best for projects of a certain size. So that's really the driver more than anything on how much we can build. I think we're going to go forward a couple. Oh, I do want to mention this, and then I think after this we may jump forward. So subsidies, I always bring this up because everybody, there's all this talk about makers and takers, and well, it's, all these subsidies are just giveaways. The HUD budget is $72 billion, or was in 23, and the Housing Choice Voucher Program was $32 billion of that. So that's like the biggest housing program in the federal budget. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this. It doesn't come as a big surprise. Mortgage interest deduction, right? So you know how it works. You pay your mortgage. You're allowed to deduct interest from your taxes if you itemize, and that number for that deduction on what would be paid in taxes otherwise is $30 billion. There are a couple sunset provisions that may occur in 2026, depending on what happens in the legislature. So it could increase as much as 80 billion. But the point is that it has to do with like how much you can deduct, or who can deduct. So there's and something could happen within the next couple of years to change that, of course. But the point is that when people get angry about housing programs and how it's inefficient, it's a giveaway, they always point here. But here we've got a $30 billion program that could almost triple. And not only that, but that benefit goes to higher income households, right? So not saying that that's wrong, but there's a policy decision that's made here that says, what's the benefit? What are we trying to achieve?
Yeah, I'm glad you're calling that out, because it's something that we've flagged a bunch as a group, where, you listen to even our local politicians talk about this stuff. Most of what they talk about is often things that are going to benefit homeowners. And I think it's in part because homeowners vote. They're seen as like pillars of the community that have been around for a long time, for whatever reason. But, I think as a group, what we've identified, our group is like 40 to 50% renters.
Exactly.
And, but yet, all of the things that we talk about with homestead exemptions and property taxes and things like that, these are all things renters are paying property taxes too. They're just not paying them directly. And, like all of these exemptions are generally going to rich is maybe not always the case, but homeowners in general are richer than renters are. And so it's a strange system that we have here that really benefits the richer people more. And I think like we're very interested in ways that like as a group we can help to change that and change the narrative around that to be more, renter friendly. Like
Right.
we give all these benefits to homeowners, maybe we should give benefits to renters too.
Yep.
Or at least not give as much benefits to homeowners, I guess.
Yeah, at the very least, it changes the conversation a little bit. So it's more balanced. Because you're right. I worked in so my background is in planning. I did my graduate work at city and regional planning, and I worked in community development for a number of years. And in Lawrenceville, when I started there in 2008 maybe, and that conversation was just starting to be had around how neighborhoods change and affordability and all that kind of stuff. And it was interesting seeing that back and forth about renters versus homeowners. And we had a lot of people stand up in meetings say, well, I'm a renter. Like I show up at all the community meetings. I show up to do tree plantings. Like I've got friends and family in the neighborhood. The fact that I'm a renter doesn't make me any less valuable than a homeowner. And it's just an interesting dynamic that I think is starting to change.
Yeah, it's like it's a common refrain. I think we obviously do a lot of like fighting the NIMBYs in this group, but it's a common refrain from people that we would probably describe as NIMBYs, which is, oh, these people are renters. We either like they don't count, their opinions don't count, they are not really part of this community. They're transients.
Right.
They're transients. They just moved here. They haven't been here forever. And it's like a really it's kind of a gross opinion in my because it's this idea that there's this certain class of people that are worth more to our community than another class of people. And I think there's a lot of whether it's anti-immigrant or racism or things like that built into those things. And people are saying them, maybe not realizing that that's what they're saying, but that is kind of what they're saying. So I think we really want to change the conversation around that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, that's a big part of this whole conversation. So I think go to the next slide. We're going to skip the next section, and I'm going to dig into one project, and then I'll talk a little bit about the low-income housing tax credit program. So I'll run through this project, which is a project that opened in 2021. So this is one of those fun projects that we started construction in 2019 and then ran into COVID. And this is located on Penn Avenue, right at the gateway to Lawrenceville. So it's, the Doughboy statue. This is literally kind of, you're looking at this, the Clementi Museum is behind you and Doughboy statue is to your left. This was a 2-building project. You can go to the next slide. I think there's more images there. Well, here gives you a location there. A 2-building low-income housing tax credit project that was built, and this was a fun one because I had worked in Lawrenceville for a number of years before moving on to a different job and then Action, so kind of coming back to Lawrenceville. And if you know this area, when I started working there, it was basically kind of rundown structures, vacant lots. There really wasn't much of anything. There was the Clementi Museum. Honestly, that was just about it. And slowly it kind of built up a little bit. So you had renovations that were happening, some new construction, and these were 2 of the last kind of final vacant lots that finished the intersection there. So it was a really fun project on a number of different levels. If you go to the next slide, a couple of images of the interior units. We had to do loft units in the smaller building that you saw to the left, just due to the small lot size, kind of backed us into this particular design. Go to the next slide. Couple different images. These face out onto Penn Avenue, so you would see the Doughboy statue to your right. Next one is just kind of the entryway. So just to give a flavor of what that building looks like. Yeah.
So you kind of already alluded to this, but just to confirm, so like I noticed like the building's like a couple, like 3 stories or something like that in total. Would you have wanted to build higher if you could, or it was a funding limitation?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. For this project in particular, we learn something new with every project, right? Or we learn hopefully more than one thing. And in this one in particular, if we could have just done whatever we wanted to do, we would have built the building on the right and we would have taken it up one story, maybe two, depending. Because when you build two buildings, you pay for a lot of things twice. You do the same things over. So a lot of the infrastructure in one building you'd only have to pay for once. So that really upped the cost of this project. And then of course, COVID added a lot of other costs and other issues. But I'm glad you asked that question, because this started with a really unique process, because Lawrenceville has a pretty robust community engagement process, both with the Lawrenceville Corporation and Lawrenceville United. So they really, and they actually owned the lot that this sat on, and then that was owned by the URA. So they facilitated, and we participated. They facilitated in kind of not a design charrette, but it was more than just a community meeting. It was a series of meetings that looked at what could be built here, what's allowable, what specifically fits with the community plans that already exist, and then what people were interested in seeing. And so from that, we got to the schematic design that ended up with this ultimate result. But it was an interesting kind of long-term process that I think it created a lot of buy-in, and also was an educational process for folks. And I mentioned that because there were a lot of there was one homeowner in particular that was behind this building. So if you know this site, this, you can kind of see it here, but this is a steep road. This is 34th Street. It goes straight up. And the houses behind there, they were worried they were going to lose their views, right? Yeah. So it was we had a very civil series of conversations around it. And this is kind of what we ended up with. Now, this is on the low end of units that we like to build, because again, there's kind of a sweet spot for this funding source. But yeah, if we could go back and just do what I think would be easiest and best, we would have done a little bit differently. But this is always a bit of a community conversation and kind of a back and forth. Yeah.
Not to dovetail too much, but for clarification, units like this, are they solely rentals, or do people have like ownership opportunities, like way a condo or something? And then if they are renters, are there additional protections for them, because Pennsylvania doesn't have too many?
Sure. So this project in particular, and just about all of what we do, are rentals. So we are, and I'll get into this. I think I've got a slide at the end, which should be at the beginning, but I added them on. It's about Action Housing. So we are a nonprofit affordable housing developer. So we build, we rehab, we develop, and we hold long term. So we don't sell anything unless there are very few exceptions for that. So our projects are affordable in perpetuity, essentially. What's that? Yeah. We manage about 1,600. We have a couple that have a commercial component where we'll typically use a third party manager. But the LIHTC, so low income housing tax credit, LIHTC for short, LIHTC program allows for a homeownership option on the back end. So you have to structure it that way, and we haven't done that here, but you can structure. There have been a couple projects in the state that have done this. One out in Philadelphia where it's essentially it's not really a rent to own, but there's a 15-year process to get to the ownership, and that has to do with how the tax credits work. So it's complicated and it takes a long time, but it's possible. And you could do that in a multifamily building, like you said, with a condo structure. Yeah.
I have a question about like the mechanics of how people qualify for your units. And then in particular, like, let's say someone moves into one of these units and has a qualifying level of income and then gets a new job and now makes more money. Do they have to re-qualify regularly? If they then are out of the income bracket, do they have to leave? Like, what happens?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'll get into some of this in some of the later slides, but let me answer that specifically because that's a really important question. The LIHTC program has a lot of different requirements, a lot of different regulations. One of the nice things about this program, I think, is that so we have to recertify every year. Every income you have to be recertified. But if you increase your income, it's not like you get the boot. You know, it's not like you have to leave. So a perfect example of this is the spinning plate artist lofts in East Liberty, so right next to the Whole Foods. That was a project that we did in like 90. Well, technically it was Linda Metropolis, who's done housing here for decades, did that project. We purchased it later on. That was done in like 97, I think. And there's still some people still living there that moved, that were in the initial move-in. Some others, you know, the income increased. We actually did a certification once, and we found someone like massively over income. And you know, the goal, I think, is to encourage people maybe to move on at that point, to make room for the next household that can really benefit from this type of housing. One, they don't have to. Yeah, there's no requirement. Although we did once find a listing on Airbnb, and that was a very quick eviction. So, or lease termination, I should say. That was a new one for me. So let me run through the sources and uses quickly, because it sounded like that was of some interest. So in general, construction costs, or as we call them, hard costs versus soft costs, which is kind of all of the rest of that stuff is split roughly 70-30. Again, this project was, we started construction in August of 2019. So these numbers changed a little bit, but in general, you've got the biggest number, your driver of your budget is your construction cost. Then you've got land purchase. Professional fees is everything from, you know, architectural, engineering, environmental, all that good stuff. And then syndication expenses. So this is what a group charges to sell the tax credits to someone who can use them. I'll get into that later, don't worry. Construction loan fees. So this is like construction loan interest, which is way higher now than it was then, with our rising interest rates. Lease up costs. The reserves is a really big number. So a lot of what we do in our budget is dictated by the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, which is kind of the overseer of that tax credit program. And they require at occupancy, when we lease up the building, that we have big reserves for like rent reserve to preserve the lowest income units, affordability, operating reserves to make sure that we have money to pay for everything if our rents drop, things like that. So that's a pretty big number you wouldn't see on maybe a market deal. The developer fee and overhead is what we get paid for doing this. In this case, it was about a 7-year project from beginning to end, most of it in about a 3-year period. And then there's other miscellaneous items. But and I'm going to mention that developer fee of 1.5 because as we go to the next slide, you'll see why that may not be quite so accurate. So this is
So
Can you go back to the other side? So how we like I've never looked at a pro forma for a market rate development. Like how would your typical costs differ from a market rate development or a mixed income development?
That's a great question. So the construction costs are going to be pretty close. There are things that we are required to include in our units. We have minimum and maximum sizes. We have to include community rooms. There's a lot of different things that are involved in the design that are dictated again by the Housing Finance Agency. But in general, that number is usually pretty close on the per square foot basis. The biggest differences really are like syndication fees and reserves. Those are different. And there are other like environmental requirements that may not be on a market rate deal, as well as funding sources. So like a lot of public funding sources have strings attached. one of the biggest one is the RCAP, which is a state grant program, but it requires, you know, state prevailing wage, a lot of purchase requirements like for American steel, a lot of different things that not only may raise the cost. I mean, prevailing wage in particular is like a quick, you know, 20% maybe on your labor, but a lot of the paperwork behind them, the compliance work, all that has a cost to it. And so that's really probably where those items and that compliance are really where the bulk of the difference lies.
Which line is it? A whole lot of
It's probably, and so some of it's here, some of it does get, you know, because we do that work. And so it kind of sucks up our time. There's always like opportunity costs, all that kind of stuff. But it would largely be there. Yeah, and then like I said, the syndication expenses are specific to this funding source. So if we go to the sources, yeah, sorry. Good question. I should know this off of the top of my head because I lived this project for too long. What's that? Oh yeah, so the question was, what's the scale of project? So like square footage wise, what are we talking about? And I'm going to get this wrong. I want to say it was somewhere around 50,000 square feet. Yeah, so it was higher than that. So maybe it was a little bit less than 50,000 square feet. Yeah, somewhere around there. They did rough numbers. Yeah. And now that number is way up. This started construction in 2019, so pre-COVID. Although we added costs during that because that's when. So remember when COVID happened, and we were really just getting started because we had a 4-month delay due to some Duquesne Light utility issues. And so when we were really getting into construction, that's when all the prices went crazy. So you saw like huge increases in concrete, weird stuff, but like concrete, timber. So like any framing, like we had a change order one day that was like $75,000 just out of the blue for the same stuff. We thought that was crazy. Fast forward a year, and a similar project was getting like 3 times that, you know, just because of fluctuations in materials costs.
Right. I mean, kind of market rate for 100% affordable.
Oh, in this project? Sorry, I should have started with that. So this is 100% affordable. So this is a low-income housing tax credit project. Everything is affordable at 60% area median income and below.
And follow up. It seems the 9% like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
If my understanding is correct, there's a rule of 20 people. You only required to do 40%. Above and beyond and get 100%. But what's the reason behind doing more affordable than you need it?
Right. Well, from our perspective, its mission is one. Although a lot of the 9% projects in Pittsburgh are 100% affordable. And I'll get into some more details on the LIHTC project or LIHTC program if we have time. That should answer some of the detailed program questions, because you're right. You can some of the data that I have here on the LIHTC program, you'll see it can support affordable units, or it can be a better way to put that is it can be part of a project that has non-affordable units in it, but it's just kind of a different side of the program that we don't typically use. Yeah.
How many units are in this building? What are the size of these units? And how much time was spent before you could even break ground, just getting permitting and all of that?
Oh, that's a good question. Too much time. Again, this was a little bit of a different process because we went through the community engagement process that I mentioned. We probably started talking about this project in 2000. Well, let's work backwards. Let me talk about this in a different way. For the low-income housing tax credit program, you apply. It's a competitive application. And typically it takes us, I don't know, from identifying a project, putting together an application, it might take, let's say, 6 months. Then it may take another 6 months before they announce awards, and then it's about a year to do all your architectural engineering, all that kind of stuff. So you're already into it for what's that, 2 years almost. And then construction timelines, it used to go a little bit quicker. Now they're at 16 to 18 months, maybe a little bit less than that if you're real quick. So the timeline on these projects is considerable, even if everything is going exactly as it should. So
Say that has a substantial deviation from commercial, or do you think commercial?
well, that's a good question. What you don't have in the market sides, you don't have that whole like application process, all of that, waiting around, seeing if you're funded, trying to cobble together some public funding. But you still have to go through the same kind of due diligence, all the entitlements. So it's, the real estate development process is not quick, but if you have funding behind you, you may not have to deal with all the sources. I mean, this is a pretty short list of sources. Now our projects, because they're becoming more expensive, everything's more expensive, and the tax credit equity is roughly staying the same, means we have to go find more funding sources, which means we have more strings attached, more compliance, all that kind of stuff. I think it seems like we always set a record, which isn't a good thing, internally about the number of sources that we use, and we had our newest record is 23 sources and that was a rough one. So quickly, I'll run through this and then we'll dig into the LIHTC projects real quick. Yep. Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't even answer your first question. This is 35 units, and the sizes are it's 20, 35. It's 31 one bedrooms, 3 2 bedrooms, and 1 3 bedroom. Did I get that right? I think that's right. Yeah. So it's typically largely 1 bedrooms. In some projects, if there's a real community need for family housing, we'll do a little bit more on the larger sizes. And we always double the required number of ADA accessible units. And
Standard double floor.
yeah. Well, on the larger building it is. On the other one, it's a mess. A good mess, but a mess. So the biggest difference that you'll see here is versus a market rate is the tax credit equity. So I'll talk about this more, but you're awarded tax credits. We don't have a tax liability, so we sell them to like a bank or whatever. They in turn give us equity that allows us to build the building. That's kind of a simplistic view of it. But essentially, this would likely be a bank loan or some other equity that you have to pay interest on if you're a market rate developer. And you can do that, of course, because you have higher rents, you have higher revenues, they can pay debt service. We have lower rents, can't pay debt service, and that's kind of the foundation of this program. So we've got the URA of Pittsburgh, which is, they're always a fantastic partner to work with. PHFA is the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, and they've got different pots of money we can pull from. So that's what you're seeing there. Affordable Housing Program, HP, is part of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh. So just different sources. We're kind of cobbling these things together as best we can. And in this case, we had some big cost overruns due to some unforeseen environmental issues, as well as COVID, as well as et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we put in a sponsor loan, which basically just means Action Housing is committing its own money. I should also say, when we say loans, these are not really loans that ever get paid back. So they're soft loans. The intention is that they're going to stay there because, again, the projects don't have cash flow to pay these back. So we put in almost $1 million of our own money, and then we deferred our developer fee. So when you think back to the last slide of about 1.5 million, I think is what we had, it's basically all plugged back into the project. So not ideal. This is not the best case scenario, obviously, but we also get funding from other foundations that we can pull from. So this is the joys of being a low-income housing developer. Next slide. Oh yeah.
maybe you're kind of getting into this in my broader discussion about, maybe this kind of gets into the broader discussion that we'll be getting into. What's like the credit appetite that exists for like, I mean, if I asked you like, how much credit appetite is there out there for like, if you could just wish all these other funding sources in the ratios that they're at, like, could you bang out, you know, I mean, obviously like your organization, there's a bunch of other limitations, but like, is there enough credit equity to do like 10 times as many units as you have?
It's a great question.
you
I'm
know.
gonna hold off on answering that until we go to the LIHTC, because it will provide a little bit more context. But if I forget to answer it directly, remind me, because it's a really good question and kind of speaks to the limitations of what this program can do.
How much of this budget income for a particular project, does any of this need to get paid back, or is it all like capital upfront that then gets spent down?
Yeah, so
You did say that you have like a loan that you're not expecting to get paid back because there's like limited cash flow. Where does the cash flow go for projects that get built?
So if there's cash flow, which is a big if, in the limited partnership agreement, which is where all this is dictated, they call it a cash flow waterfall. So it goes to all these different things first. Usually goes to reimburse the investors. So the people who provided this tax credit equity, if they've put anything else in, they want to get paid back first. And then sometimes the URA or PHFA, this can vary. They may take a percentage of the cash flow. So instead of like on your mortgage, like you have to pay it in full every month. And if you don't, you know, you're going to lose your house. Here, it's written as a percentage of cash flow. So they may take 50% of cash flow. They may take 25. They may take all of it. But if you don't have any cash flow at the end of the year, you don't have to pay. If you do, you have to pay a portion of it. But it's never intended, like the URA puts this into the project to make it happen. They don't put it into the project to get it back. On a per project basis. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And that's always, it's always very thin to begin with because it's affordable housing. So there often isn't any cash flow, or if it does have cash flow, it's nominal. Yeah. Yeah.
So tax credit equity, who does that come from?
Great question. Next slide. Well, actually, so this is just a quick illustration of the rents. Oh, and I did get that right. 31 one-bedroom, 3 two-bedroom, 1 three-bedroom. This is an illustration of the difference in rental revenue from an affordable versus if this same building in the same location were market rate. And we know this number. We know this number because we had to do a rent comparability study for HUD as part of this whatever, doesn't matter. Point is, these are the rents that they said we could achieve with these units, and they account for everything. Like, do you have you don't have a pool? All right, we'll deduct you for that. Well, you have a common room. Okay, we'll add something. So it's meant to compare apples to apples. But there's a difference in annual rent of, what is that, $580,000. I mean, that's the money that typically would go towards debt service, right? Or a portion of that would go towards debt service. There's a whole set of slides that I have in here about how that debt service is calculated and all that kind of stuff, but we'll skip those to get to the LIHTC stuff. So you can go all the way until it says thank you, and then there should be a couple more slides after that are specific to the LIHTC program. You can go one more. That's history of action housing, which I should have started with. So this will be a quick couple slides on the low-income housing tax credit program. So this is not a HUD program. This is an IRS program because it's tax credits. So the way that the tax credits are allocated is on a per capita basis for each state. So in Pennsylvania, any state is $2.75 per person. The LIHTC program serves low-income households at 60% AMI or less. So in Pittsburgh, the 2023 numbers were $42,000 for a single person, roughly $60,000 for a family of 4. Restricts rents for 40 years, as I mentioned. Because we have an affordable mission, we keep our properties in perpetuity. And it created roughly 156,000 units in 2021 under this LIHTC program. Go to the next slide. Nationwide, sorry, nationwide. Yeah, and I'll get to the Pennsylvania because this is going to get at your question. So since it began, 3.2 million units nationwide on average, about 1,400 projects and 100,000 units per year in the country. When we look at all new housing units that are built in the country well, since the 1990s, LIHTC has financed between 3 and 5%, which it seems small. But when you look at the new multifamily apartments, it accounts for about 25% of those in the last 20 years or so. The reason, of course, is because we build a lot of single family housing. So, but the percentage of that multifamily is much higher. And when you look at new affordable rental housing, it's about 90% of all new affordable rental housing nationwide is financed through the LIHTC program. So next slide. So this gets kind of to your question. The federal allocation total is a little over 13 billion. Pennsylvania, so we've got a population of just under 13 million. So you multiply that by 2.75, and you get the total allocation for 2023 of 35.5 million. But here's kind of the rub. So these are all in every state. You have what's called a housing finance agency. They're the ones that facilitate the awards. They take in applications. They kind of oversee your projects. In Pennsylvania, it's PHFA. In the last funding round, there were 73 applications, which is actually down from what it typically is, but only 33 awards statewide. So this full allocation is getting spent on 33 projects like the one that I showed you. City of Pittsburgh got 6 awards, which is a lot. Typically, we only get 3, somewhere around there, and then 2 more in the county for a total of 8. But this is what it's producing on an annual basis: 361 units, 320 of those of which are for low income. So when we think about that, I'll get you 1 second. When we think about that deficit that I talked about at the very beginning, that was from the Peduto administration, they said right now we could use 17,000 units like this, and we're building 320 a year. So this is why I say we need all of it. Like LIHTC is not going to solve this, even if we double what this is and triple. It's not gonna fill the need that's there. So every tool in the toolbox is necessary.
So what percentage of the applications that your organization makes are successful, and how much does it cost you as an organization to make an application? Like, how many man hours do you spend on this?
Oof, that's a good question. We can usually quantify the hard cost of putting something together, so because we know what we have to pay our architect for schematic design, we know what we have to do for environmentals, market study, all that kind of stuff. We don't track as closely like what's my time on it. I think we typically say it depends, 50, 75,000 maybe. There are other state housing finance agencies that require essentially shovel-ready projects, and that would be $1 million at the minimum. So the nice thing about the way Pennsylvania is set up is that we have to show a lot of feasibility, so they have to feel comfortable that it's ready to go. But we don't have to spend $800,000 on architectural plans until we know that it's going to be funded. So that's a kind of a helpful difference that we've got. Right. So we've been really fortunate. I would say that we are probably successful. I'd have to think about this. 80% of the time, maybe. But the thing is, it's also a political thing. So you have to build support for your projects. We also, so when there are 6 awards in the city of Pittsburgh and 2 in the county, we can't put in 4 applications. So typically the most that we'll put in is 2, 1 in the city and 1 in the county. That's just kind of our approach. But it's very rare for even an organization like ours to be awarded 2 projects in 1 round. So that's happened twice in the 10 years that I've been at Action Housing. The more typical award is 1 or frankly none. I mean, we've been shut out on plenty of funding rounds. I think there might be there's one more slide on tax credits. Actually, there's a couple. We don't have to dive into this, but essentially the way that it works is we put in an application to PHFA. They say yes, we like it. You're awarded tax credits. We then have to find an investor. So we work with a group called NEF, which is the syndicator. So they're the matchmaker between us and a bank. We put out an RFP, try to get the best pricing we can, and the syndicator sells those tax credits to the bank, whoever has wants to invest and has a tax liability. I'm going to blow through this a little bit because I know we've got a couple more slides, and I don't want to run out of time for more questions. But the way that it works, and I'm sorry if this is too in the weeds, but the tax credits are just a dollar for dollar credit against taxes that a bank, let's say it's PNC or BNY Mellon, since we're in Pittsburgh, and they're able to take that over 10 years. So the allocation to us would be 1.2 million. You take that over 10 years, simple math, 12 million. But that's not necessarily the amount of equity we get because it's a market. So sometimes it's as low as 91 cents per dollar. Sometimes it's as high as $1.06. I think is the highest we've ever gotten. In the project that I showed you, we had a $1.2 million allocation that generated just under $11,700,000 in equity. And there's a lot of reasons why that fluctuates. But there are other benefits for the investor. So they can take the depreciation, tax losses, they can amortize costs. There are a lot of additional benefits. Of course, they get a lot of those origination fees and interest costs that I pointed out, as well as a small management fee annually over it's 10 years that they get the tax credit, but there's a 15-year compliance period. And then there's also, you may be familiar with the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA obligations. So banks have obligations for both lending and grant making, and this is one of the best investment and lending projects that they can do to get CRA credits, which are important when they go to make acquisitions of other banks. They get reviewed by the Fed. Yeah, so part of it's actually a really interesting act. I highly recommend kind of digging into it a little bit, but I forget what all the criteria are, but some of it is where you lend. So it doesn't matter where your bank is, but you have to lend kind of consistently across your footprint. Some of it is where your bricks and mortar stores are. There's a lot of different components to it, but the idea is that it's it's pushing for more equitable banking lending in general. That's kind of the short version of it. But these obligations are very real because anytime a bank wants to acquire other banks and grow, they get graded on this, and it's a pretty high threshold that they have to meet. The next slide. So that's kind of the benefits to the investor. Benefits to the developer is a little different. You've got your creation of housing, of course. This one wasn't a set aside for veterans, but we often have a set aside of supportive housing. So a certain number of units will have a preference for individuals with physical or intellectual disabilities. We've done a project for individuals on the autism spectrum, veterans, seniors, kind of everything in between, youth aging out of the foster care program. And then we get a small management fee, a share of cash flow, as I mentioned, if available. Very rarely is it available. And of course, the developer fee is the big one, but on our most recent projects, that's been harder and harder to protect as the projects kind of suck up additional money. And then in year 15, it will likely be debt free or have a minimum of debt remaining. That's less for us as a nonprofit developer than it would be for others. I think that might be the last slide, the very ending slide. So that's like a quick and dirty rundown of the LIHTC program. But it's the number of units. The question that was asked here earlier was kind of how many units can be constructed, and it's limited not only by the by the size of the allocation at the federal level, but also the market that determines kind of what those credits are actually worth.
So just real quick, are there any questions online? Okay, so we have like 5 minutes remaining in the scheduled program. One of the things that you and I talked about prior to starting today was what an advocacy group like ours can do
yeah.
to help make it easier for you to build more affordable housing. And so I wondered if you could maybe talk about that for a few minutes. And if there's questions about that, that's great too. But I thought it would be interesting to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for reminding me of that, because that's a really important part of this. The first thing is what it sounds like you're already doing, and is like a core tenet of this organization, and that's just showing up and advocating for housing, being a yes instead of no, kind of like the Irish Center that we were talking about. Because again, this problem isn't going to be solved by affordable housing developers or the LIHTC program. Like, it requires, at scale, the building of a lot more housing at every income level. And so that's number one. Number two is, I'll tell a quick story about the construction of, this was before Kraus Commons. So the building that we showed on here, the old Poli, right? Old Poli location. We did a series of community meetings, and at one of the first meetings that we had, it's well attended, a lot of good engagement, but there were some folks that stood up and said, I'm not really into this. This is like low income. It's going to bring the kind of people in our neighborhood that we don't really want. It's going to drop my property values. Not necessarily in those words, but that was the sentiment. And we didn't have to say anything. So like our representatives, Lena was there, others, Jody worked on the new project, so she would have been there. We didn't have to respond and say, well, your property's data shows doesn't really drop. Also, our neighborhoods are for everyone. We need, we didn't have to do any of that. The community stood up and said all that. And they didn't even have to pull from data. They just said, no, Squirrel Hill is a neighborhood where we've said it's important to be inclusive of everyone, whether that's race, religion, income, whatever the case is. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't happen overnight. And obviously that takes like a lot of community conversations. And I'd like to think that it's not specific to Squirrel Hill. I'd like to think that there's a lot of other neighborhoods that feel that way, and that as they recognize this issue are being more vocal and outspoken about it. But it was, at that time, it was a really special moment because we hadn't really seen that in our community meetings. We were used to advocating for the project and making an argument for the project. But when you have invested residents, who are coming to these meetings and saying, no, hold on a second, this is important to the neighborhood. It makes a huge difference. I mean, we left that meeting, and I remember having a conversation with our team, and just kind of, it felt like a huge shift. As simple as it was, it felt like earth shattering. So I would say those two things are the biggest by far.
So you said there were 6 applications. You normally don't try for more than 2 because you're competing. I'm kind of curious who you're competing with. Are they all nonprofits? Who are the big people working on this stuff?
Yeah, so it's a mix. We are by far the largest affordable housing developer in Western Pennsylvania, but there are organizations that are like us that operate on a national scale. But there are also for-profit developers that do really good work in this space. So the program is so kind of regimented. There's a lot of rules and requirements you have to follow that it's difficult to do. It's almost a kind of a niche kind of thing. But both nonprofits and for-profit developers are involved in LIHTC. So we wouldn't call them competitors because we work together, but Trek does really good work. AM Rodriguez, they specialize a little bit more in senior housing and do a lot of stuff around the county, less in the city. But Trek Trek has done a bunch of projects in the city, and they're probably one of the most active developers in this space. Who else? Cleveland Housing Network is starting to do some work in and around Pittsburgh, but other local groups would be like Beacon Communities. Actually, they're kind of, it's a local offshoot of a company out of Boston. Yeah, I mean, there's not a lot because I mean, there's a good number. There's enough for it to be competitive, but there's not, you know, a lot because the funding is kind of restricted. Again, six projects in Pittsburgh, 8 across the county. So, you know, you don't have too many mouths to feed. You've got, you know, 50 developers or whatever. So, and it is very specific. So a LIHTC project is going to be really different from a market rate. So you really have to understand the rules and regulations behind it. Otherwise, you can get into a lot of hot water. So it's typically you see developers that do these projects do them over and over, so that you can kind of get familiar with everything, get a little bit smoother process on compliance and all that kind of stuff. So it's the developers that are doing it are usually doing it for the long haul.
It is 8:30 now, so I think we'll conclude the official program. But if you're still available, I mean,
Sure.
I'm sure Jack has more questions. So
I get the feeling that Jack always has more questions. But well, first, let me just say I just really appreciate you having me, and this type of engagement is awesome. The work that you guys are doing is incredible, and thanks for all the really good questions.
yeah, and
Super fun.
we really appreciate you coming out and spending time.
Yeah,
with us.
absolutely. Yeah.